All right. So thanks, Fiona, for introducing me. I don't think I need to talk about myself much. I had timed my talk at 35 minutes, so I'm going to skip through some of my early slides in the interests of getting to discussion a bit quicker. To give you an idea of what to expect from my talk, I am going to give a really quick background to my topic, go through two studies that I've completed and analyzed, but really the focus of my talk today is on some surprising results that we found and figuring out how to explain these results in a future study that we're planning at the moment. And I have some extra information at the end of the talk to sort of guide that discussion. But I'm really seeking advice and ideas from the group here about constructs we might want to measure in this upcoming study. So to give you a background, I don't think anyone really needs to be told that political relations in the US are fairly strained at the moment, as exemplified most prominently and dramatically by the riot that occurred at the Capitol building in response to the 2020 presidential election. We know that relations in the US are characterized by greater opinion polarization than was in the past, but we also know that we exaggerate these differences more than reality. So even though they are getting further apart on their opinions, we also exaggerate the extent to which this is true. There's also the case of affective political polarization. We now feel, well, I'm going to keep saying we, but I'm referring to US citizens. They now feel more negative to their political opponents than they did in the past. And you can see their feelings about their in-group actually haven't changed much. But this has progressed to the extent that their feelings for the out-group actually now outweigh how warm they feel towards their in-group. And in case you think this is just a US problem, this is comparable data from Australia. So you can see that even though in the US polarization has increased quite a bit over the last couple of decades, the evidence seems to suggest that in Australia that we already were at that same level of political divide. And I've got the data there for the UK as well. This results in a bunch of negative consequences, including reduced efficiency of government as partisans fail to compromise or negotiate. This has been seen in the US in shutdowns of the US government, particularly during Trump's reign. And increased support for violent extremism, which is due to a perception that the system doesn't work anymore. And I think this is quite predictive of the riots that happened in response to the election. A fantastic summary of all of this work is by Finkel et al., who classified this intergroup tension as political sectarianism. They're using the metaphor here of a religious sect, which they feel is more appropriate than just tribalism as a kinship-based metaphor. And this is composed of three components, they argue. Othering of the opponent, intense aversion to the opponent, so dislike and distrust of the opponent, and a really intense moralization of the opponent as well. I come back to this a bit in my talk. So what is the solution to this problem? Well, if you ask President Biden, he has suggested that we can address political polarization if we open our souls instead of hardening our hearts, and if we're willing to stand in the other person's shoes. So what Biden's talking about here is empathy. Specifically two components of empathy: empathic concern, otherwise sometimes called sympathy. In my talk, I refer to this a lot as affective empathy. This is concern for another's well-being. It's not necessarily matching what the person you're thinking about feels, but it's a concern for their improved well-being. And the second component is perspective taking, which I also refer to as cognitive empathy in this talk. So taking on the opponent's point of view, thinking through their situation, it helps you predict their behavior and what they might actually want out of the situation. And we know from existing research that empathic concern improves helping behaviors, particularly in charitable giving type studies. and perspective taking has been predictive of greater success in negotiations. And this is not just one-sided success, this is coming to a mutually beneficial conclusion. So you can see why improving helping behaviors and success in negotiations might be especially beneficial in the political context, where there's really no desire to negotiate, whereas there's these standoffs at the moment. We do have some existing information about how empathy, how we see our outgroups in empathy, in relation to empathy. Sakara et al. In particular have looked at the intergroup empathy bias. We find that we generally have less empathy for our outgroups than our in-groups, but this seems to be dependent on whether there's a context of competition or resource scarcity or threat in this intergroup context. So without these elements in place, we actually have equal empathy for our outgroups compared to our in-groups. However, this has not been previously tested in politics, with one exception that I will mention a bit more towards the end of the talk. So we really wanted to make sure that this was also the case in politics as a starting point. Which drove my first hypotheses for these studies, that we'll have less empathy for our political outgroups than for our political in-groups. But I also wanted to look at mediators to explain what might be causing or preventing empathy for opponents, particularly because empathy is usually fairly instinctive. In fact, some research has shown that empathy inductions sometimes work because people are restricting their empathy in the control conditions compared to the empathy-inducing conditions. So it seems really important to figure out what people are, what is driving people to reduce their empathy for political outgroups. The known predictors of empathy in an interpersonal context are similarity for a good deal of the literature. But then Batson et al. Really argue that similarity cannot explain why we feel empathy for certain targets, such as animals. In that case, he argues for a more nurturance explanation. So it's because we like these targets more that we have more empathy for them. And these two elements of similarity and liking tie in quite closely to the political situation, where we can see that we have low perceived similarity between ourselves and the opposing party and low liking of ourselves and the opposing party. But there's also this aspect of moralization in this intergroup context in particular. And I also think that this will predict reduced empathy. In fact, this drives what I think is the most novel aspect of my PhD. This is the slide that I used in my 3MT that really demonstrates, I think, if we are training ourselves to see our political opponents as evil, then it makes sense that we wouldn't actually extend empathy towards these people. Because what motivation would you have to find empathy for someone who you think of as morally evil? So this idea drove my title, Sympathy for the Devil, and also is representative of my second hypothesis in these studies, that moral judgment should mediate the effect of knowing a target's politics on empathy for that target. So to get to the actual studies, and in fact, study 1 and 2 are quite similar. They are online Qualtrics surveys. The first study had 549 participants after exclusions. We targeted US residents because that's where most of this political polarization research takes place. They were recruited via Prolific, and we had roughly equal numbers of self-identified conservatives and liberals. It took on a 2x3 design. So we had the participant politics as one of these IVs, and the second IV we varied the target that we were showing participants. So they either saw a liberal target, a conservative target, or an ambiguous target. But we actually conceived our second IV as in-group neutral out-group. So if liberals saw a liberal target, they would be treated as being in the in-group condition. But if conservatives saw a liberal target, I've treated them as being in the out-group condition. The stimuli were just text, what you can see on the screen, so roughly 5-6 sentences. They all started with a description of a person, sort of some demographic information, where they work and their family life, followed by some information about their politics. So either they are politically conservative or liberal, and an active member of the local branch of the Republican or Democratic Party, or we left out this sentence entirely in the neutral or ambiguous condition. We also had an empathy induction at the end, so some sort of stressful event that occurred to this person that might provoke empathy in the viewer, but not so extreme that it seems inevitable that we would extend empathy. Potentially people who see this person as an out-group would feel like it's okay to have less empathy, or even schadenfreude, pleasure at the opponent's pain. So that was the aim with those, that empathy inductions scenarios there. Our measures of empathy were adapted where possible, but most of these measures had to be novel because empathy in existing research tends to be measured in a more general sense at a trait level, rather than empathy for specific targets. So we had a lot of items that were novel, and for that reason, I ended up running a factor analysis to make sure that we had reliable constructs in play. But they turned out pretty much as you can see on the screen. Negative affect we didn't include as a measure of empathy, but was also a way that we measured responses to the target, just making sure we have that political polarization as well before we look at the differences on empathy. So we measured affective empathy, or empathic concern or sympathy, depending on how you want to call it. And this was measured in the sense of the PANAS, the positive and negative affective scale. How much do you feel towards this person? Not at all too extremely. We also measured how much participants agreed or disagreed with some statements related to cognitive empathy. So how much do you feel you can understand what this person is going through? Empathic intentions, which aimed at getting closer to behavior. So do you think you would actually help this person if you encountered them? And some measures of negativity, originally intended to get at schadenfreude and pleasure at the opponent's pain, but those measures had very little variance. So what was left was measures of negativity like avoidance of the target, and how much do you think this person actually deserved the suffering that they were going through? And those were measured strongly agree to disagree, +5 to -5. Well, that's how I coded those anyway in these results. We took 1 item measures of liking and similarity and 2 items to measure morality. And again, these were on scales of strongly agree to disagree. There were some other measures that we took as well, most notably of strength of identification with political group. And here I don't just mean identification as a conservative or liberal, but also identification as a Republican or Democrat. And we did covary to take into account variance on these measures, and they did not change the results that I'm about to show you. Okay, here we go. In the general sense of the intergroup context, we did find that people show less empathy for a political outgroup than a political in-group or a neutral party, but there was no difference in empathy for the political in-group compared to the neutral target. And this actually matches what we find in a lot of previous research in other intergroup contexts. Empathy tends to be about the outgroup derogation, removing empathy from your opponent, rather than any special boost in empathy to your in-group. However, this effect was moderated by participant politics to the extent that sharing these results as they were would actually be misleading if we didn't mention it. We didn't expect to find any differences on participant politics, but we thought we really needed to check if this was the case regardless. And it turned out that was a good thing for us to have done. So the pattern that I just showed you was true for the Liberal participants, but for the Conservative participants, they actually showed no significant differences between any of these conditions. So this means that Conservatives showed equal empathy to fellow Conservatives as they did to outgroup Liberals. And not only that, but this pairwise comparison of ratings for the outgroup was significant, indicating that Conservatives seem to have more empathy for Liberals than Liberals do for Conservatives. And these are the other measures. I focused here on affective empathy, but that is representative of the pattern that we found across all of the measures. We ran a multivariate analysis, and this is the pattern that was confirmed. And if we go to the mediation pathways, this is, I know, a very complex model, and I can come back to this and explain a bit more if people are interested. But what this shows in a brief overview is that when people see an outgroup member compared to an in-group member, they reduce their ratings of morality of that person, of similarity, and of liking, and this flows on to explain different aspects of an empathy. These showed successful mediation pathways, but these mediations were moderated again by participant politics, such that Liberal participants rated their outgroups, Conservatives, as much less moral, much less similar to themselves, and liked them less, compared to Conservatives who saw a Liberal target, which of course explains why later on there's a difference in empathy between Liberals and Conservatives. So on the one hand, yay, our initial hypotheses were supported, but there is this big elephant in the room, which is that moderation by, I see people laughing, I'm glad that landed. We can't ignore that there was this difference in participant politics. Now, it's possible that this was just noise in the data, and we did not have enough statistical power to detect a 2x3 interaction in this first study. So to address this problem, we ran the study again, pretty much as is, with a higher N, so that we would have power to detect an interaction in this study. So this is 958 participants, again, after exclusions. And we ran this in the UK in case some of the messiness in the data was due to the coronavirus was actually just starting to take hold in the US at the time. So possibly something around that might have explained the messiness in that data. So that's why we ran it in the UK. And again, recruited via Prolific and tried to get even numbers of Liberals and Conservatives. The survey was almost identical. Any references to the US were changed to the UK. There were some slight changes to the empathy measures. The factor analysis that we ran for the second study said that the empathic intentions and negativity items should actually both be loaded onto the same factor. So intentions to help the target and the opposite of intentions to avoid or beliefs that the target deserved their suffering. I named this compassion as it gets at some of the more intentions to help, which some argue is the difference between compassion and just empathy. So the results for this study, for Liberals, the same pattern as we found in the US. For Conservatives, it did seem like we found the pattern that we were expecting, in that in this case, Conservatives did show reduced empathy towards their outgroup compared to their in-group and to neutral targets. However, we did find both this pairwise comparison again was significant, and the interaction, the 2x3 interaction, was significant in this case, indicating that even though we found a similar pattern for Liberals and Conservatives, this pattern was significantly weaker for Conservatives than it was for Liberals. And this slide might help for comparisons if that's of interest to anyone. The mediation, again, showed successful mediation through morality, similarity, and liking. But again, this was moderated by participant politics, each of these pathways. Liberals just seem to be more judgy of their outgroup in each of these ways of ratings of morality, similarity, and liking than conservatives are. And this flowed on to explain the differences in empathy. So I don't want to skip over the implications of our confirmed hypotheses. We do find that the intergroup empathy gap applies in politics as well, which is a fairly novel finding. And it's also interesting that morality does mediate this effect. This means that it suggests that empathy inductions, it might be important to target morality in order to improve empathy across political parties. But because of this moderation, perhaps it's especially true for liberals. And moving forward, we really want to get to this head scratcher of why this effect was consistently weaker for conservatives than liberals. Our initial thoughts were that maybe it was something about the influence of government, of the political leaders at the time. Both of the studies that I mentioned were tested in 2020. So Trump was in power in the US and Boris Johnson in the UK. So both of these are a conservative-led government. So perhaps something about conservatives being in power meant that conservatives felt like they could be more generous to liberals. So because of this, we intend to run our next study in the US again, now that Biden has the presidency, because perhaps something about the government being more liberal will explain or change this pattern of results. Initially, we were just going to run the study pretty much as is with higher power so that we can actually confirm whether that interaction took place. But after we submitted this paper to Psych Science, and after some feedback from their reviewers, after extended review, they pointed out some literature that we hadn't really engaged with and suggested that we didn't really have anything super novel in these first two studies. The results can be explained by what's happened in other areas, and they didn't really buy this liberal bias. So unless we explain it a bit more, I don't think we have the novelty to be able to publish this work. So going forward, we really want to figure out ways to test possible explanations for these results, rather than just running the study again in the US and seeing how the data lies. So at this point, I do want to encourage you to start thinking about what your explanations for these results are. But I do have some more information that I think is really relevant to guide how we might think about what's happening here. So why would there be a difference between liberals and conservatives? It implies that liberals and conservatives must differ on some relevant dimension, either in general, in like a trait sense between the two groups, like religiosity perhaps, something that was happening at the time of the studies, so the social context, or just differences in response to our study, something about how we recruited, the measures that we used, the stimuli that we used, may have provoked different responses in liberals and conservatives. I don't really think that traits differences between liberals and conservatives are likely to explain our results, because it was contradicted somewhat by evidence from the one study that I mentioned early on that has actually looked at empathy in a political context before. So I'm going to mention that study now. So this was by Hassan et al. They followed actually quite a similar procedure to our own. I should mention that even though we ran our studies after Hassan et al., we had no knowledge of the study, so it's quite in some ways a happy coincidence, in some ways an unfortunate coincidence that they had a very similar design to the way we ran it. They did run their studies across 3 countries, the US, Israel, and Germany, but found no differences in the patterns of results. So they actually collapsed their data into a single data set of 910 participants. But they did test liberal and conservative participants, their responses to in-group, neutral, and out-group targets. They used written stimuli. They used a stressful situation to induce empathy. In their case, all of their targets were injured in a political protest, which I think is a bit interesting and distinct from our own stimuli. And they did use some quite similar outcome measures to our own. But their results looked quite different to the pattern that we found. They did find, oh, and I've colored these in to aid in comparison to my own results. So they do find the same intergroup empathy bias that is found in the bulk of the literature. So less empathy for the political outgroup compared to the in-group and the neutral condition. But instead of an interaction between the two, they actually find a main effect of participant politics. They find that across the board, liberals were more empathetic than conservatives. And this is actually fairly representative of a lot of literature as well that suggests that liberals have higher trait empathy than conservatives. The one other thing I wanted to mention about this study before I move on is that their governments also were quite conservative. So if we're thinking that changing the study to test it in the US under Biden now being a more liberal government might explain the differences or the patterns that we found, that doesn't explain why we found different results in our studies under conservative governments compared to Hassan et al., who also ran under conservative governments and found a different pattern of results. So that's a bit of an additional head scratcher. But
James,
I don't.
Wasn't Obama in control when
Yes.
Hassan? Sorry, yeah. So
Obama
was controlling the States.
So this study was published in 2018. I've had to guess. I haven't spoken to these authors yet about when they actually collected the data, but my best guess is it would have been at the end of Obama's time in power. However, Obama was also had to contend with a Republican-led Senate. I believe that's the case. So even though there was a liberal in the presidential power, the government as a whole might not have been seen as terribly liberal, or the perceived influence that liberals may have had might not have been very high. But for the comparison between that study that I just showed you and our own results, I don't think just a trait explanation of differences between liberals and conservatives is terribly likely. What do we think is happening? What do I think is happening? And Fiona and Eric have suggested some things as well, is probably something about the social context at the time of the studies were taken. And particularly things around competition and threat, which, as I mentioned earlier on, these are the contexts where we do find empathy gaps occur. If these aren't there, then the gap disappears. So perhaps liberals and conservatives differed somehow in their perceptions of how competitive or how threatening the opponent was at the time. We've thrown around a few models of how we think this might work. I want to go through some of these to show you how we're thinking at the moment, and then open up to ideas about what other variables we might need to consider and where in the models these might go. So in the new study, we do want to get more into the specific morals that might be violated. This not only would test differences in symbolic threat, but we also know that liberals and conservatives differ on the types of morals that they value. So it's possible that liberals saw conservatives to violate more of the morals that they cared about, and conservatives didn't see that as much. I don't really think that would explain the differences in empathy, but it is worth looking at as an extra bit of novelty in that study. So that's one thing that we intend to do. But we're also considering looking at perceptions of how zero-sum politics is. So you can imagine that some people might think it's an incredibly zero-sum win-lose situation where either your party forms government or you have no power at all. And on the other hand, you could be seeing politics as more of a collaboration between the government and the opposition. And I can imagine how that would affect your sense of threat, and that would flow onto your ratings of how immoral you think the opponent is and how empathetic you are to them. But then there would also be this influence of which party is actually in power. Is it your own group or not? And these might interact with zero-sum thinking in a few ways, such that if you think that you're in a situation of zero-sum competition, but you have very low in-group influence, that's the situation of very high threat. And that should be the situation that we'd expect in the past studies, Liberals under Trump and Liberals under Johnson. But if these perceptions were, well, we know that Conservatives should have had a higher perception of their in-group influence in both of these studies. Potentially they had less of a sense of that zero-sum competition as well. So if that overall sense of threat was less, then perhaps that explains why there was more empathy for their opponents. But we're also not certain where these should go in the model. Potentially these are mediators of some sort rather than moderators. Maybe they moderate or mediate at later stages. So I'm interested for any ideas around that as well. And I'm also considering some other theories like integrated threat theory and the instrumental model of group conflict. So I've included these slides in case they help guide discussion as well. That's all that I wanted to present from my side now. I'm really keen to get any advice on what you think we should include in this future study and why you think we found the results that we did. Before I open it up, I do just want to thank my advisors for their ongoing patience and support. So thank you, Fiona, who is here, and Eric, who can't make it. And thank you all for listening and for any advice that you have as we go forward.